In this video, I make my first trip to the Sawtooth Mountains in Idaho for a weekend of backpacking and landscape photography with my Hasselblad X2D. For years I had seen incredible images of the jagged peaks of the Sawtooths, but even at 6 hours away from my home in Utah, it wasn't until now that I had finally put together a trip to see them. The weather forecast warned of possible precipitation that weekend, not to mention below freezing temperatures, and I later find out a large forest fire would threaten the entire trip, bordering many of the trails I'd be hiking that weekend. All of this setting up this trip for a boom or bust for photography opportunities. The first part of my trip would include a 20-mile round-trip overnighter deep into the Sawtooths with a pristine lake and a dramatic mountain pass as my ultimate destinations. The inclement weather motivated a few last-minute purchases that hopefully would keep myself and my gear dry. Sawtooth Wilderness requires self-issued permits you fill out at the trailhead. It also doesn't allow for drones or campfires in many locations. Policies I have somewhat mixed feelings on. As far as the campfires go, it does appear to be somewhat justified by the fact that there was a forest fire in the area at the time of my trip. Although, there is something to be said for the peace and comfort that a campfire can give a solo camper alone in the wilderness on a cold night in bear country, and I would have to go without for this trip. This trip would definitely challenge my philosophy on day hikes versus backpacking trips. The appeal of a backpacking trip is you get to experience your location in various types of light, including a sunset and a sunrise, while on a day hike you often only get one crack at it. Now the downside to backpacking is obviously all the extra gear you need to bring to comfortably survive the night. More gear equals more weight equals a more difficult hike. And as a photographer, it's all of that gear plus your camera gear. Now if you're smart, you are extremely selective about which cameras and lenses you take on a trip like this, but I always somehow manage to justify bringing just about everything, including my heavy wildlife setup, just in case I run into something. Finally arrived at my destination, completely exhausted from the long hike with my overpacked bag, along with 20 pounds of photography gear. After setting up camp, I cooked some dinner and began scouting out locations and compositions as the late afternoon and evening light was beginning to hit. Something I can't get enough of with the Hasselblad is the color science. There's something about those deep, natural greens that I just haven't seen in other cameras. Sometimes when the light isn't exactly what you're going for in a given composition, going black and white can really feature those details, especially on this 102 megapixel sensor on the Hasselblad X2D. I woke up shortly before dawn to the sound of rain and sleet softly hitting my tent. I'm not sure if there's a more soothing sound in the world.
So, unfortunately, I woke up to overcast skies, which really put a damper on my morning photography. My morning shot from Alice Lake was obviously a bus, so I didn't even bother. And figured, while I'm crossing my fingers for any sign of light at all, I would make the hike up to the pass with the overlook shot. But I'm not gonna hold out too much hope because it's just overcast across the board, and I don't see any way light's gonna find its way through that anytime soon. So yeah, this is the risk you obviously run anytime you do photography, is these kind of weather conditions are always a possibility. So you just proceed forward and hope something changes. Also kind of funny that one of my big concerns going into the trip was the cold. And honestly, if anything, I was too hot last night and slept with my sleeping bag unzipped. So, I don't know, I can never get it down with camping. Either you don't bring enough and you're too cold, or you bring way too much and you're too hot. And I'm not sure if I've ever experienced that in between. It's always one or the other with camping. But I guess I'd rather be a little warm than cold, so it's all good.
I made it to the top of the aptly named Snowy Side Pass just as a light snow began to fall, probably the first snow of the season. It was such a beautiful view that I just waited there for a moment and took it in before pulling my camera out.
You know, in a way, these conditions are disappointing. I mean, this shot was really, the reason I came out here. Obviously I have other things on the itinerary, but this was kind of the shot of the trip. And it's disappointing not to get that classic alpenglow. On the other hand, though, if that's all you shoot, all of your photography kind of starts to look the same. So in a way, even though it can be disappointing, conditions like these do help diversify the type of photography you do so that, it doesn't all just blend together into the same style. So I'm actually kind of happy how it turned out. Having the snow and the mist at least gave me something to work with as opposed to just the boring overcast. So I think I had good timing getting up here to at least capture that.
The rain wasn't letting up, and that meant I was going to have to break camp with wet gear, but I still had one more thing left to do after eating a quick breakfast. I have this thing where I can't just camp at a lake and not go for a swim. No exceptions for winter conditions. This was the part of the trip where regret started to set in. There's nothing quite worse than packing up wet, muddy gear in the cold, not to mention the 5 or 10 pounds of water weight it added to my bag. Those last few miles seemed to drag on forever. All joking aside, seeing my truck in the parking lot was one of the best views of the trip. I got a cabin at the Redfish Lake Lodge and spent the afternoon allowing all of my gear to dry out. After a relaxing afternoon recovering from the brutal 20-mile hike, I spent the evening along the shores of Redfish Lake to capture the sunset. The news coming out from the forest fire wasn't good, and my plans for the next day appeared to potentially be compromised by the path of the forest fire. In order to not take any risks, I changed my plans and instead would be hiking Hell Roaring Lake the next morning for sunrise. While I don't have the original destination to compare it to, I think it's safe to say that the change of plans paid off. After 30 miles in the Sawtooths, it's safe to say this won't be my last time here.